Hello everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. I'm excited to have you here as we explore the fascinating world of reinforcement and behavior change. The title of our session is Reinforcement, the Foundation of Behavior Change. Over the next few slides, we'll look at key concepts like how behaviors are established, maintained, and how reinforcement works in different ways. We'll also discuss positive and negative reinforcement, and how these principles help us understand learning and behavior in real-world settings. Let's get started and dive into these important ideas together. It's crucial to understand that reinforcement always means an increase in the occurrence of the behavior. The modifiers, positive and negative, describe only the type of stimulus change operation, not the desirability or ethical nature of the procedure. An aversive stimulus refers to stimulus conditions whose termination functions as reinforcement, often involved in escape or avoidance learning situations. These situations are characterized by escape or avoidance contingencies, meaning the behavior increases in frequency because the behavior results in the removal or termination of an aversive stimulus. Essentially, the removal of something unpleasant strengthens the behavior. When we talk about negative reinforcement, think of it as behavior that increases because it leads to the removal or reduction of something aversive. Examples include praise, tokens, or preferred activities, things that, when added, reinforce the behavior by making it more likely to happen again. On the other hand, positive reinforcement involves adding something desirable immediately after a response, which makes that response more likely to occur in the future. For instance, giving praise or tokens when a behavior occurs. So, to sum up, both positive and negative reinforcement serve to increase behavior, but they do so in different ways, either by removing an aversive stimulus or adding a positive one. And understanding this distinction is key to applying reinforcement effectively in behavior management and intervention. Extinction requires consistency. If reinforcement is provided even occasionally during the extinction procedure, the behavior may persist longer or become more resistant to future extinction attempts. When we talk about extinction, the key idea is that, over time, the behavior should decrease in frequency and eventually stop. But it's important to understand that this doesn't usually happen instantly. Instead, behaviors often linger for a while before they start to decline, and sometimes we even see a temporary increase in the behavior, which is called an extinction burst. This is a normal part of the process. If we withhold reinforcement from all members of a behavior class that was previously reinforced, then we are applying the extinction procedure. This is a core concept in behavior analysis because it directly targets the behavior's maintained function. So, in summary, extinction involves stopping reinforcement to weaken or eliminate a behavior. The process takes time, and understanding these patterns helps us stay patient and consistent, leading to more effective behavior change over time. Let's clarify the terms positive punishment and negative punishment. The words positive and negative here don't refer to whether the behavior is good or bad, or whether we want it to increase or decrease. Instead, they describe what happens with the stimulus involved. When we say positive punishment, it means we're adding something or presenting a stimulus after the behavior to reduce its likelihood in the future. For example, giving extra work or reprimands. The key point is that a stimulus is introduced following the behavior, and that leads to a decrease in the behavior. On the other hand, negative punishment involves removing something that the individual finds reinforcing, like privileges or responses cost, after the behavior. This removal of a stimulus results in the behavior decreasing as well. It's important to remember that in both cases, the goal is to decrease the behavior, but they do so through different operations. Negative punishment involves stimulus withdrawal, while positive punishment involves stimulus presentation. Understanding this distinction helps us better design behavior interventions, because the effect, decreasing behavior, is the same, but the way we achieve it differs based on whether we're adding or removing stimuli. This connects to the overall theme of understanding how consequences influence behavior through different stimulus operations. Let's break down how punishment works. Both positive and negative punishment are designed to decrease the likelihood of a behavior happening again in the future. The key difference between them is whether a stimulus is added or removed as a consequence. Positive punishment involves adding something unpleasant to reduce behavior, while negative punishment involves taking away something desirable. Now, on the flip side, reinforcement, whether positive or negative, aims to increase the chances that a behavior will occur again. Again, the main distinction is whether a stimulus is added or removed after the behavior. Positive reinforcement adds a pleasant stimulus, and negative reinforcement removes an unpleasant one to encourage the behavior. It's important to see that these operations, whether reinforcement or punishment, are defined by these two dimensions: what kind of stimulus change happens, and how that change influences future behavior. Understanding these four basic principles helps us see the full picture of how behavior is influenced and shaped in different contexts. This knowledge is foundational as we explore how to effectively apply behavior management strategies. On this slide, we're focusing on the idea that behavior principles are relatively few in number. These include key concepts like reinforcement, punishment, extinction, stimulus control, and motivating operations. These principles actually form the foundation of all behavior analysis. They help us understand how behavior works and the basic scientific laws that govern the relationship between behavior and the environment. Each principle is an empirical generalization, meaning it's based on many carefully controlled experiments. This gives us confidence in their reliability and applicability. What's really important is that these principles are universal. They apply across different individuals, species, settings, and behaviors. They describe fundamental processes that are consistent across the board. When we talk about a principle of behavior, we're describing a functional relation, how behavior relates to one or more controlling variables. These principles are like the fundamental laws that explain how behavior functions across various contexts and situations. Now, it's helpful to distinguish between principles and tactics. Principles are the broad, scientific laws, while tactics are the specific strategies we use based on those principles. Understanding these core principles helps us see the bigger picture in behavior analysis and guides effective intervention. Applied behavior analysts, or ABAs, use various tactics to help people learn and use socially significant behaviors. While there are only a few core behavior principles, there are many derivative tactics we can apply. These include backward chaining, differential reinforcement of other behavior, or DRO, shaping, prompting, fatting, and token economies. These tactics are how we put principles into action. They're the technological part of ABA. Think of technology here as the practical application derived from basic principles. These tactics come from foundational behavior principles, but are designed to be broad and flexible, working across different subjects, settings, and behaviors. That's why they're codified and widely shared. A behavior change tactic is essentially a research-backed, consistent method for changing behavior. They are the practical tools behavior analysts use to apply these principles in real-world situations. So, when we talk about principles versus tactics, remember that principles are the fundamental laws of behavior, while tactics are the specific strategies we develop from those principles to create effective change. These tactics help us implement principles practically, making our interventions more effective and tailored to individual needs. Let's talk about the momentary effectiveness of unconditioned reinforcers and how it depends on our current motivating operations. For example, if someone is very hungry or food-deprived, food becomes an effective reinforcer because it satisfies that biological need. But if that same person has just eaten a big meal, food is unlikely to work as a reinforcer at that moment. This shows how our biological states, like hunger or satiety, influence what motivates us and what reinforces our behavior. Now, this concept ties into why motivating operations matter so much. They change how effective a reinforcer is by altering our biological need for it. Take physical comfort, for instance. Access to a comfortable temperature or a cozy environment can reinforce behaviors that help us achieve and maintain that comfort, depending on our biological needs at the time. Similarly, water is a great example. When we're dehydrated, water becomes a powerful reinforcer because it addresses a fundamental survival need. Without water, our motivation to seek it out increases significantly. The same goes for food. When we're hungry or deprived, food becomes a highly effective reinforcer because it meets that critical biological requirement. And to clarify, an unconditioned reinforcer is a stimulus change that can boost the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future, without any previous learning or pairing. It's effective simply because of our biological makeup. Things like food, water, and temperature regulation are naturally reinforcing because they satisfy essential survival needs. They don't require us to have learned their value. They are inherently powerful in shaping behavior based on our biological state. Let's talk about events that serve as unconditioned reinforcers and punishers. These are essentially built into our biological makeup through natural evolution. They've been shaped over time because they support survival. A key example of an unconditioned punisher is painful stimulation, which can cause tissue damage. Think of extreme heat, cold, pressure, or any stimulus that threatens our physical safety. What's important to understand is that these punishers are effective because of our evolutionary history, not because we've learned them through experience. They don't require any prior conditioning. They simply function as punishers naturally. To put it simply, an unconditioned punisher is a stimulus change that, when it occurs, decreases the likelihood of a behavior happening again in the future, without needing to pair it with any other form of punishment beforehand. This concept ties into our overall understanding of how certain stimuli influence behavior naturally, without any learned association, reinforcing the idea that some responses are hardwired for survival. Let's take a closer look at the stimulus pairing procedure responsible for creating conditioned reinforcers. Essentially, this process is very similar to how we create conditioned punishers. The main difference is whether the neutral stimulus is paired with a reinforcer or a punisher. This process allows the neutral stimulus to acquire the ability to reinforce or punish behavior on its own, independently of the original unconditioned stimuli. When we talk about the conditioned effect, it occurs at the same time as the unconditioned reinforcer or punisher. Initially, the neutral stimulus has no reinforcing or punishing effect at all. It's just a neutral stimulus. But through repeated pairing, it begins to change function. It can become a conditioned reinforcer or punisher. This is all about the pairing process. When the neutral stimulus is paired with a consequence, such as a reinforcer or punisher, it can later act as a conditioned consequence itself. The key takeaway here is that stimulus events that happen just before, during, or alongside other reinforcers or punishers can acquire the ability to influence behavior later on. So, in summary, neutral stimuli become powerful tools through association. They learn to reinforce or punish behavior based on their prior pairings with other consequences. The learning mechanism behind this is quite elegant in its simplicity. Through repeated pairing, stimuli acquire new functions as reinforcers or punishers. Let's explore how peer attention can serve different functions depending on the context. For example, it might act as positive reinforcement in one situation, encouraging a behavior because the individual seeks social approval. But in another case, it could serve as negative reinforcement if removing peer attention strengthens a behavior, perhaps because the person wants to avoid the peer's attention altogether. This highlights a key insight. A single stimulus can function as a positive reinforcer under some conditions and as a negative reinforcer under others. It's important to understand that reinforcers and punishers are not just about physical changes. They're about how stimuli function in a given situation based on the individual's history and current circumstances. Now, when we talk about functional classification, Social praise and attention are great examples. They are widely effective conditioned reinforcers across many cultures, but their impact can vary quite a bit from person to person and situation to situation. This brings us to the idea that the specific events that act as reinforcers or punishers are highly individual and constantly changing. They depend on each person's recent experiences and personal history, what we call ontogeny, rather than biological evolution alone. So the key takeaway is that the ability of conditioned stimuli to influence behavior is rooted in each person's unique interaction history with their environment. It's this individual history that shapes what becomes a conditioned reinforcer or punisher for them, making the process dynamic and highly personal. A phone's ringing acts as a discriminative stimulus, or SD, for answering the phone. When it rings, we typically answer because that ringing signals that reinforcement. Connecting with a caller is available. Conversely, when the phone is silent, we tend not to answer. This example is classic because it clearly illustrates how certain stimuli can influence our behavior. This idea helps us understand how we learn to respond appropriately depending on the situation or context. Behavior that occurs more often under specific antecedent conditions than in others is called a discriminated operant. Since it happens more frequently in the presence of a particular stimulus, we say that this behavior is under stimulus control. Now, the key point here is that operant conditioning isn't just about the relationship between behavior and consequences. It also involves creating functional relations between behavior and antecedent conditions. That is, the events that happen before the behavior occurs. This process gives rise to what we call the discriminated operant. And when we say discriminated operant, we mean that the context or situation actually matters. It influences whether the behavior is likely to happen or not. Recognizing this helps us see how behavior is not just a response to consequences, but also shaped by the cues and stimuli in our environment. This framework provides the foundation for analyzing why behaviors occur and how to change them. However, contemporary behavior analysis has expanded this model. The four-term contingency analysis takes into account motivating events that make certain stimulus changes momentarily more or less reinforcing, adding another layer of complexity to our understanding of behavioral control. The three-term contingency, antecedent behavior, consequence, is commonly called the ABCs of behavior analysis. According to Glenn, Ellis, and Greenspoon in 1992, this relationship is considered the basic unit of analysis in the analysis of operant behavior. The ABCs consist of the environmental change following the behavior, which is the consequence, the observable and measurable response of the organism, which is the behavior, and the environmental condition or stimulus present before the behavior, known as the antecedent. Together, these three components help us understand the context and function of behavior, forming the core of how we analyze and influence change. Understanding both aspects of contingency, dependency, and temporal contiguity is essential for effective behavior analysis and intervention design. Behavior is influenced by the consequences that immediately follow it, regardless of whether those consequences were directly caused by the behavior or just depend on it. This is why superstitious behaviors can sometimes develop. People might associate certain actions with positive outcomes even if there's no real connection. When we talk about immediate effects, we're emphasizing that the timing of the consequence plays a crucial role. Contingency, in this context, refers to how closely in time the consequence follows the behavior. The closer the consequence is in time, the stronger the contingency. This brings us to the temporal dimension. The dependency relationship between behavior and consequence is what sets truly contingent consequences apart from mere coincidences. If the consequence depends on the behavior, meaning the behavior must occur for the consequence to happen, that's a key aspect of contingency. In simple terms, contingency is about dependency. When a reinforcer or punisher is contingent on a specific behavior, it means the behavior must occur for that consequence to follow. Recognizing this dependency helps us understand how behaviors are maintained or altered over time. Now, let's talk about how recognizing these three components in real-world situations helps us, as behavior analysts, really get to the root of why behaviors stick around. When we understand the functional relationship between the antecedent, behavior, and consequence, we can design interventions that actually work. The key here is to see how each element influences the next and how they all connect to shape behavior. Moving on to practical application, each example in this diagram shows us how an antecedent sets the stage for a behavior to occur. Then, that behavior is followed by a specific type of consequence. And here's the crucial part. That consequence will determine whether the behavior is likely to increase or decrease in the future. It's a cycle that we can observe and influence. Next, let's look at how these components operate across all four basic behavior principles: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. The diagram illustrates these three-term contingencies in action, showing how they are fundamental to understanding and modifying behavior effectively. By analyzing these components, we can better anticipate and influence behavior patterns, making our interventions more targeted and successful. Let's talk about behavior controlled by verbal statements, which is known as rule-governed behavior. This is different from contingency-shaped behavior, which is learned through direct experience with natural consequences. The key point here is that humans can learn complex behaviors quickly through instructions, rather than needing extensive trial and error with real-world outcomes. Now, when we look at verbal behavior itself, it often acts as a controlling variable for many other behaviors, both verbal and nonverbal. This means that our words can influence what we do, help us guide ourselves, and plan future actions. This brings us to the self-control function of verbal behavior. Our ability to use language really boosts the complexity of our behavior. It allows us to think ahead, set goals, and regulate ourselves, things that are much harder without language. Finally, it's important to recognize how responses influence each other. One response can have a ripple effect, shaping subsequent responses and creating intricate chains of behavior. Human actions rarely happen in isolation. Instead, they are interconnected, forming complex networks that drive our overall behavior. All of these points highlight how verbal behavior contributes to the remarkable complexity and adaptability of human behavior. These advanced behavioral processes help explain the remarkable adaptability and complexity of human learning. They demonstrate that our behavioral capabilities extend far beyond simple stimulus-response associations to include derived relations, emergent behaviors, and flexible repertoire recombination. One key concept is contingency adduction. This is a process where a behavior initially selected and shaped under one set of conditions is recruited by different contingencies and takes on a new function within a person's repertoire. Essentially, it shows behavioral flexibility, our ability to adapt behaviors to new situations and functions. Another important point is derived relational responding. This phenomenon demonstrates that humans can derive relationships between stimuli they have never experienced together. This greatly expands what we can learn from limited direct teaching, because we can infer and relate stimuli based on their context or other learned relations. Lastly, stimulus equivalence is a fascinating area of research. It has shown that under certain conditions, learners can acquire new skills and verbal relations without direct instruction on those specific skills. Instead, new behaviors emerge as a natural consequence of learning related skills, which again highlights the incredible flexibility and interconnectedness of human learning. Together, these processes highlight just how complex and adaptable human behavior truly is, reinforcing the overall theme that our learning capabilities are far more dynamic than simple stimulus response chains. When we look at the interactions between different types of conditioning, it can really complicate our ability to identify the true causal variables behind a behavior. This idea is captured under the concept of causal complexity. Emotions, for example, often reflect a mix of respondent and operant behaviors happening at the same time. We call this the respondent-operant interaction, and it shows how these types of behaviors can blend together, making it tricky to pinpoint what's actually driving the response. Another important point is that different sources of control can sometimes support or oppose the same behavior. We refer to this as competing influences. It means that multiple factors or contingencies might be acting simultaneously, some encouraging a behavior, others inhibiting it. That's where the idea of concurrent contingencies comes in. Multiple contingencies operating at once can increase or decrease the likelihood that a behavior will occur in a given situation. All of this highlights a fundamental truth about the environment. It's inherently complex. Many behaviors don't stem from a single cause, but from a combination of factors, a phenomenon called joint control. This occurs when two related aspects of a person's verbal behavior come together to influence a response that wouldn't have happened if only one of those components was involved. So, in summary, understanding the complexity of controlling variables involves recognizing that behaviors are often the result of multiple, interacting causes. This complexity makes analyzing and predicting behavior more challenging, but also more reflective of how dynamic real-world environments truly are. Understanding individual differences is really crucial because it has deep implications for how we apply behavioral principles in real life. It means we can't just assume that what acts as a reinforcer for one person will be effective for another. Similarly, even if two individuals display similar behaviors, the underlying factors maintaining those behaviors might be completely different. Each person's behavior repertoire, the range of actions they can perform, has been shaped by their unique history of reinforcement over many different situations and experiences. No two people experience the world exactly the same way, which means they come into any situation with different backgrounds of reinforcement and punishment. These diverse environmental experiences create complex learning histories that influence how we behave today. Because of this, people often respond very differently, even sometimes very drastically, to the same environmental conditions. This variability isn't random or mysterious. It's a direct reflection of each individual's unique learning history. Recognizing these individual differences helps us understand why responses vary so much from person to person, and underscores the importance of tailoring our approaches to fit each individual's unique background. As we come to the final slide, I want to highlight how all these practical complexities, when combined with the behavioral and environmental factors we've discussed, make the application of behavior analysis both challenging and ultimately rewarding. Success in our work requires more than just technical skills. It demands creativity, flexibility, and persistent problem-solving to adapt to real-world situations. It's also crucial to remember that all our decisions must be guided by professional guidelines, always respecting client dignity, choosing the least restrictive options, and ensuring social validity. These ethical considerations are central to responsible practice. On top of that, legal factors like regulatory requirements, consent procedures, documentation standards, and liability concerns influence how we design and implement interventions. We need to operate within legal frameworks to protect both clients and ourselves. Organizational policies, cultural considerations, stakeholder buy-in, and community values also play a big role. They help determine what interventions are acceptable and appropriate in different settings. Financial factors, such as budget limitations, insurance coverage, cost of materials, and personnel expenses, can restrict the options available to us. These economic realities often shape what we can realistically implement. Logistical challenges, including scheduling constraints, resource availability, staff training needs, and coordination across multiple settings, add another layer of complexity. Implementing effective behavior change programs in the real world requires us to navigate these practical obstacles. While our understanding of behavioral principles gives us a strong foundation, translating that knowledge into effective interventions means continually working through these various constraints. Ultimately, these obstacles are part of the broader challenge of changing behavior in applied settings. But by staying adaptable, ethical, and resourceful, we can overcome these hurdles and make meaningful progress.